I married a stranger 2 hours after my fiancé left me at the altar. The sentence still doesn't feel real when I say it, like it belongs to someone braver, or maybe someone more broken than I ever thought I could be. But it happened, and it started with silence. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that hums in your ears when a room full of people suddenly decides you're the most embarrassing thing they've ever seen. I was standing there in a white dress that cost more than my car, holding a bouquet I didn't even remember choosing, staring at an empty aisle where a man was supposed to be waiting for me. Instead, my phone buzzed. Just once. A single message. I'm sorry. I can't do this. No explanation. No call. Just gone. And the worst part? He didn't disappear alone. I saw them. 10 minutes later. Through the glass doors of the venue. Him, laughing. Her, wearing the dress I helped him pick out for a work event. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just stood there while people whispered behind their champagne glasses, pretending not to stare. My mother tried to say something. My bridesmaid reached for my hand. I couldn't feel any of it. It was like my body had decided to shut down before my heart had the chance to break properly. And that's when I noticed him. He wasn't part of the wedding. I would have remembered. He stood near the back of the room, completely still, like he didn't belong to the chaos unfolding around him. Dark suit. No tie. Hands in his pockets like he owned the air he was breathing. He wasn't looking at the guests. He was looking at me. Not with pity. Not with curiosity. With something sharper. Like recognition. Like he'd already made a decision I hadn't even been offered yet. I don't know how long we held eye contact. Seconds. Maybe longer. Time felt distorted. Then he moved. Not fast. Not slow. Just certain. People shifted out of his way without being asked. Conversations dimmed without anyone realizing why. Power doesn't need to announce itself. It just arrives. He stopped in front of me, close enough that I could smell something clean, expensive, controlled. Not overwhelming. Just precise. Like everything about him. You shouldn't be standing here alone, he said, his voice low, steady, completely unaffected by the disaster I was still trapped inside. I blinked. That was it. That was all I could manage. Because something about him made everything else, the whispers, the betrayal, the humiliation, fade into background noise. Then again, he added, tilting his head slightly as if reconsidering, maybe this is exactly where you needed to be. I should have walked away. Any sane person would have. But I didn't. Because for the first time in the last 20 minutes, I felt something other than emptiness. Not comfort. Not safety. Something dangerous. Who are you? I finally asked, my voice quieter than I intended. His lips almost curved. Not quite a smile. Someone who doesn't leave, he said. And for reasons I still can't explain. I believed him. He said he was someone who did not leave, and the terrifying part was not the confidence in his voice. It was how easily the world seemed to agree with him. I glanced past his shoulder and noticed something I had not registered before, the subtle shift in the room. The way staff avoided looking directly at him. The way conversations lowered without anyone being told. Like gravity had quietly changed direction, and everyone could feel it except me. I should have stepped back. Should have created distance, but my feet stayed exactly where they were, rooted in a moment that no longer belonged to the life I thought I had. You are staring, I said, because it was the only defense I had left, something small and normal in a situation that felt anything but normal. I am deciding, he replied, just as calmly, as if that was a perfectly reasonable thing to say to a stranger in a ruined wedding dress. Deciding what? I wanted to ask, but the words caught somewhere between my pride and the hollow space my fiancé had left behind. The doors behind me opened again and laughter drifted in, sharp and careless, and I did not need to turn around to know who it was. My chest tightened, not from heartbreak, not anymore, but from something colder, something quieter. Humiliation has a way of settling into your bones, of making you feel smaller in a room that used to fit you perfectly. Do you want to stand here while they watch you fall apart? He asked, his tone unchanged. Or do you want to walk out like none of this ever had the power to break you? I swallowed, because that question was not simple. It was a choice between two versions of myself, one that stayed and became a story people whispered about over drinks, and one that walked away without giving them the ending they expected. You talk like you know me, I said, lifting my chin just enough to remind myself I still could. His eyes held mine, steady, unblinking, like he had already memorized every reaction I had left. I know enough. he said. And I know what happens next if you do nothing. I let out a breath I did not realize I was holding, my fingers tightening around the bouquet until the stems pressed into my palm. I could hear my name being called somewhere behind me, soft at first, then more urgent, like someone trying to pull me back into a life that had already slipped out of my hands. I did not turn. Instead, I looked at him, really looked this time, at the precision in his posture, the restraint in his movements, the kind of control that did not need to prove itself. What are you deciding? I asked finally, because if I was about to step into something unknown, I needed to hear it out loud. There was the faintest pause, not hesitation, just timing, like he understood the weight of the moment better than I did. Then he spoke, each word placed exactly where it needed to land. Whether you walk out of here alone, he said, or whether you leave with someone who makes sure no one ever looks at you like this again. My heart did something unexpected, not a flutter, not a rush, something steadier, like it had found a different rhythm entirely. Outside, I could hear traffic passing, the distant hum of the city continuing as if nothing inside these walls mattered. But inside, everything had shifted. I glanced once toward the doors, toward the life that had just rejected me, and then back at the man standing in front of me, offering something I did not fully understand, but could not ignore. And for the first time, since the message appeared on my phone, I felt the smallest spark of control return to my hands. And what would that cost me? I asked quietly. His answer came without hesitation. Nothing you cannot afford, he said. And then, softer, almost like a promise, but everything you thought you lost. And somehow, that was the moment I realized walking away was no longer the hardest part. Choosing what came next was. Nothing you cannot afford, he said, and the words should have reassured me. But instead they settled somewhere deeper, somewhere that understood this was not about money or convenience or even revenge. It was about control, and I had just lost all of mine. I looked down at my hands, still holding the bouquet like a prop from a life that had already ended, the white petals now slightly bruised from how tightly I had been gripping them. And for a second, I wondered how many choices in my life had been made out of fear of losing something, of losing someone, of losing the version of myself I thought I needed to be. If I walk out with you, I said slowly, forcing each word to be deliberate. This is not a favor, this is not charity, and I am not something you picked up because you felt sorry for me. His gaze did not shift, did not soften, did not challenge. It simply stayed, steady and unreadable. I do not feel sorry for you, he replied, and there was something almost sharp in the truth of it, something that cut through the last bit of illusion I was holding on to. Good, I said, because pity would have broken me more than betrayal ever could. A flicker of something passed through his eyes then, not amusement, not approval, something quieter, like acknowledgement. Then understand this, I continued, my voice steadier now, stronger than I expected. I will not be owned, I will not be controlled, and I will not replace one mistake with another. The room seemed to hold its breath again, as if even the air wanted to hear how he would respond. For a moment, he said nothing, and in that silence I felt the weight of what I had just done, standing in front of a man who clearly did not hear the word no often, and giving him terms like I had any power left to negotiate. Then he stepped closer, not invading, not overwhelming, just enough to shift the space between us. You think this is about control, he said quietly, but you are still thinking like someone who just lost everything. His eyes dropped briefly to the bouquet in my hands, then returned to my face. I am offering you something else entirely. I should have asked what that meant, should have demanded clarity, but something told me he would not answer in a way that made sense. Not yet. Behind me, I heard footsteps approaching, familiar voices, the kind that carried concern wrapped in curiosity, the kind that would pull me back into explanations and sympathy and questions I did not want to answer. I closed my eyes for half a second, just long enough to make a decision that would divide my life into before and after. When I opened them again, I did not look back. I let the bouquet fall from my hands, the soft thud against the polished floor sounding louder than it should have, like a door closing somewhere deep inside me. His gaze followed the movement, then returned to me, waiting, not pushing, not rushing, just waiting like he already knew what I would do. 2 hours ago, I said, my voice quieter now but clearer than it had been all day. I was about to marry someone who made me feel small without even trying. I took a breath, steady, controlled. If I walk out with you, it is not because I need saving. Another step closer, not toward him, but toward the decision itself. It is because I refuse to stay where I was not chosen. Something shifted in his expression then, not visible enough for anyone else to notice, but I felt it, like the slightest change in pressure. Before a storm, he extended his hand, not commanding, not demanding, just there, an option, a line between two versions of my life. Then walk, he said simply. I looked at his hand, then at his face, and for the first time since everything fell apart, I did not feel like I was reacting. I felt like I was choosing, and that made all the difference. So I placed my hand in his, not because I trusted him, not because I understood him, but because in that moment, he was the only person in the room who did not look at me like I had lost something. He looked at me like I had just become something else. The moment my hand touched his, everything changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that felt final, like a line had been drawn behind me, and there was no version of me that could step back across it. His grip was firm but not restrictive, steady in a way that made it clear he was not asking for control. He was offering direction. Do not look back, he said quietly, not as an order, but as a fact, and something in my chest tightened because I knew if I turned around, even for a second, I might hesitate. So I did not. We walked. Not rushed, not hidden, just walked. Through a room full of people who had watched me fall apart less than 10 minutes ago, and now watched me leave with a man no one dared to question. I could feel their eyes, hear the whispers trying to form behind polite smiles, but none of it touched me the way it had before. Humiliation only has power when you stay in it. Outside, the air felt different, cooler, sharper, like the world had reset itself the second I stepped beyond those doors. A black car waited at the curb, engine running. Silent and patient like it had been there long before I made my decision. The driver stepped out immediately, opening the rear door without a word, his movements precise, practiced, respectful in a way that made me realize this was not a coincidence. This was preparation. I hesitated for half a second, just enough to register how quickly my life had shifted from predictable to something else entirely. You still have time to walk away, he said, watching me carefully now, not pushing, not assuming. I looked at him, really looked this time, at the calm certainty in his expression, the absence of urgency, the quiet understanding that whatever I chose next would not be undone. No, I said, and the word felt different leaving my mouth this time. Not defensive, not reactive, just clear. I slid into the car. The leather seat was cool against my skin, the interior silent except for the faint hum of the engine. And when he followed, closing the door behind him, the outside world disappeared completely. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The city moved past the tinted windows, lights stretching into blurred lines as we pulled away from the only version of my life I had known. Where are we going? I asked finally, because even though I had chosen this, I still needed to understand it. Somewhere quiet, he replied, his gaze forward, focused, as if every step of this had already been mapped out long before I walked into it. I let out a slow breath, leaning back slightly, the weight of the dress, the day, the decision settling into my body all at once. And after that, I asked, softer now. This time, he turned his head, looking at me fully, not assessing, not measuring, just looking. After that, he said, you decide if you meant what you said. I frowned slightly, not expecting that answer. About what? I asked. His eyes held mine for a second longer than necessary, and there it was again, that quiet intensity, that sense that he was always a step ahead of the moment. About not staying where you are not chosen, he said. The words landed differently now. Heavier, more real. Because I had already proven them once tonight. The car slowed, turning onto a quieter street, the noise of the city fading into something distant and irrelevant. I looked out the window, then back at him, and for the first time, I felt it, not fear, not uncertainty, something else entirely. Anticipation. Because whatever came next, it was not something that had been decided for me. It was something I had stepped into on my own, and somehow, that made it more dangerous than anything I had left behind. The car came to a slow, controlled stop in front of a building that did not try to impress anyone. which somehow made it more intimidating than anything I had seen that day. There were no flashing signs, no dramatic entrance, just clean lines, dark glass, and a quiet presence that suggested whoever owned it did not need attention to prove anything. The driver stepped out again before I could reach for the handle, opening the door with the same precise timing, and for a second I stayed where I was, sitting in the soft silence of the car, realizing that every step forward was another step deeper into something I did not understand. "We are here," he said, his voice calm, patient, like he had all the time in the world for me to decide. I looked at him, searching for something that would tell me this was a mistake, something uncertain, something human in the way people usually hesitate before doing something irreversible. But there was nothing like that in his expression. He was not rushing me, but he was not doubting this either. I stepped out. The ground felt steady beneath my heels, but everything else felt like it had shifted into a different version of reality. Inside, the building was even quieter, polished floors reflecting soft lighting, the air cool and controlled, like every detail had been carefully considered. A man at the front desk straightened immediately when we entered, not surprised, not confused, just aware. "Good evening, Mr. Moretti," he said, his voice respectful but measured. So that was his name, Dominic Moretti. It settled into my mind like a key fitting into a lock I had not realized was there. Dominic did not slow down, did not pause for introductions or explanations, just gave a slight nod and kept walking, and I followed, because at this point, stopping felt more unnatural than continuing. The elevator doors opened before we reached them. No button pressed, no waiting. Just open, like the building itself was expecting him. We stepped inside, and as the doors closed, the outside world disappeared again, replaced by a quiet that felt heavier this time, more intentional. I glanced at the panel, but there were no numbers, just a smooth surface and a small light that shifted as we began to move. "You planned this," I said, not accusing, not questioning, just stating what had become obvious. "I plan everything," he replied, just as simply. I let out a small breath, something between disbelief and reluctant understanding. Of course he did. The elevator slowed, then stopped, and when the doors opened, it was not into a hallway, but directly into a space that felt less like an apartment and more like a private world. Wide windows overlooking the city, lights stretching for miles, furniture arranged with the kind of intention that made everything feel effortless. I stepped inside slowly, my eyes taking in the space without really focusing on any one detail, because the scale of it all was too much to process at once. "This is yours," I said, turning slightly toward him. "This is where I live," he corrected, and there was something subtle in the difference, something that made it clear this place was not just owned. It was controlled. I nodded once, absorbing that, then crossed my arms lightly, grounding myself in something familiar. "So this is the part where you tell me what happens next," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. He watched me for a moment, not evaluating, not testing, just observing like he was giving me space to stand on my own. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a single sheet of paper, placing it on the table between us. "No," he said quietly. "This is the part where you decide if you stay." I looked at the paper but did not touch it yet, because something in the way he said that told me this was not a suggestion, not a temporary arrangement. It was something else entirely, something permanent. I lifted my gaze back to his, and for the first time since I met him, I felt the weight of what this really was, not an escape, not a reaction, a choice that would define everything that came after, and somehow, standing there in a place that was not mine, with a man I barely knew, I realized I had never been more aware of myself than I was in that moment. I did not reach for the paper right away because something in me understood that once I touched it, this would stop being a moment and start becoming a reality. The room was quiet in a way that made every small movement feel louder, the faint hum of the city outside barely reaching this high. Like even the noise knew it was not allowed in here. "What is it?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer would not be simple. Dominic did not move closer, did not try to guide me. He simply stood there with that same controlled stillness, like he had already given me everything I needed to decide. "A marriage license," he said. The words landed without impact at first, like they needed a second to catch up to the weight they carried. I let out a small breath, almost a laugh, but there was no humor in it. "You do not waste time," I said. "Time is the only thing no one gets back," he replied. I finally looked down at the paper. The clean lines, the official formatting, the empty spaces. Waiting for signatures that would tie two lives together in a way that could not be undone by a message on a phone. My name was already there. Olivia Bennett. Written clearly, confidently, like it had always belonged next to his. I felt something shift in my chest. Not panic, not fear, something sharper, like standing at the edge of something irreversible and realizing I had walked there on my own. "You had this ready," I said, quieter now. "I had options ready," he corrected. I looked up at him, searching again for that hesitation, that doubt, but there was none. He was not forcing this, not manipulating it. He was offering it like a door that would only open if I chose to walk through it. "And if I say no?" I asked. He did not answer immediately, and for the first time, I saw it. Not weakness, not uncertainty, just a pause, like he was choosing his words carefully because they mattered. "Then I take you wherever you want to go," he said finally. "And this ends here." Simple, direct, no pressure hidden beneath it. I studied him for a second longer, and that was when I realized what made this so dangerous. Not the power, not the control, not the way the world seemed to move around him, but the fact that he was giving me a choice and meaning it. Most people do not. Most people say they will let you choose, but they have already decided for you. He had not. I looked back at the paper, at my name, at the blank space beside it, waiting for something that would change everything. 2 hours ago, I was about to marry a man who could not even stay long enough to say goodbye. Now I was standing in a room with someone who had planned 10 steps ahead, but still left the final one to me. "This is not revenge," I said slowly, more to myself than to him. "No," he agreed, his voice low, certain. "It is not." I picked up the pen resting beside the paper, the weight of it heavier than it should have been, like it understood what it was about to do. My fingers tightened slightly, not from hesitation, but from the awareness that this was not a reaction anymore. This was a decision. I signed my name. The motion was steady, deliberate, no shaking, no second-guessing, just one clean line that connected the person I had been to whatever I was about to become. When I finished, I set the pen down carefully, not rushing, not looking away. Dominic stepped forward then, just enough to take the paper, his eyes moving over the signature like he was confirming something he had already known. Then he signed his name beside mine, just as steady, just as certain, Dominic Moretti. When he placed the paper back on the table, something in the room shifted. Again, subtle but undeniable, like a quiet agreement had just been sealed. I looked at him, waiting for something to change, for him to say something different, to act differently, to claim something. But he did not. Instead, he met my gaze with the same calm intensity and said, "You can still walk away tonight." I stared at him, surprised, because that was not what I expected, not after this, not after everything. "And if I do not?" I asked. His expression did not change, but his voice dropped. Slightly, softer, more personal. "Then you stay," he said. "And everything changes from here." I held his gaze for a long second, feeling the weight of that choice settle into something real, something solid. And for the first time that night, I did not feel like I was losing control. I felt like I was stepping into it. "Everything changes from here," he said, and the words did not feel like a warning. They felt like a quiet truth that had already started unfolding the second the ink dried on that paper. I exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that comes after a decision you cannot take back. And for a moment neither of us moved, like the room itself needed to adjust to what had just happened. "So what now?" I asked, because even though I had stepped into this, I still needed to understand the rules of a world I had never seen before. Dominic did not answer immediately. Instead, he walked past me toward the floor-to-ceiling windows, his reflection merging with the city lights beyond the glass. And for the first time, I saw him not as a stranger offering me something impossible, but as someone who existed fully in a world that I had only just entered. "Now," he said, his voice carrying easily through the quiet space, "you stop thinking like someone who is waiting for things to fall apart." I frowned slightly, crossing my arms without realizing it. A familiar gesture that felt smaller in this place. "That is not exactly something you can just turn off," I replied. He turned then, facing me again, and there was no judgment in his expression, No impatience, just that same steady certainty. No, he agreed. But it is something you can replace. I let that sit for a second, unsure if I liked how easily he said it. Like changing the way I saw my life was just another step in a plan he had already accounted for. And what do I replace it with? I asked. He took a few steps closer, not enough to close the distance completely, just enough to make the space between us feel intentional. With the understanding that no one in your life gets to decide your worth again, he said. The words hit differently than everything else he had said so far. Not sharp, not commanding, but direct in a way that made them hard to ignore. I looked away for a second, my eyes drifting back to the city outside. The endless movement of people who had no idea that my entire life had shifted in the span of a few hours. You make it sound simple, I said quietly. It is not simple, he replied. It is necessary. I let out a small breath, the tension in my shoulders easing just slightly, not because I fully believed him, but because for the first time, someone was not telling me to be patient, to understand, to wait for things to get better. He was telling me they already could be different. And where do I fit into all of this? I asked, turning back to him, because that was the part that still felt unclear, the part that mattered most. His gaze held mine, steady, unwavering, like he had been waiting for that question. You do not fit into it, he said. It adjusts to you. I blinked, caught off guard by how easily he said that, like it was the most natural thing in the world. That is not how anything works, I said, shaking my head slightly. A faint shift crossed his expression then, not quite a smile, but close enough to feel intentional. It is how my world works, he replied. The confidence in his voice should have been overwhelming, but instead it felt grounding, like standing next to something solid after spending too long in uncertainty. I studied him for a moment longer, trying to understand how someone could speak like that without hesitation, without doubt. And then I realized it was not arrogance, it was experience. He had built something that moved the way he wanted it to, and now he was offering me a place inside it. Not beneath it, not controlled by it, but within it. And if I decide I do not like your world? I asked, testing the edges of this new reality. His answer came without pause. Then you change it, he said. I let out a quiet laugh at that. Not because it was funny, but because it was the first time that night something felt almost unreal in a way that did not scare me. You really believe that? I said. I do not believe things I cannot control, he replied. I held his gaze for a long second, feeling the weight of everything settle into something clearer, something more defined. I had not just walked away from my past. I had stepped into a future where the rules were different, where the expectations were not built on keeping me small. And as I stood there, in a place that did not belong to me, yet somehow felt like it could, I realized something that shifted everything again. He had not taken control of my life. He had handed it back to me in a way I had never experienced before. He had handed my life back to me. And that realization should have made me feel powerful. But instead it made me feel something far more unsettling. Because for the first time, there was no one else to blame for what came next. I stood there for a moment longer, letting the silence stretch. Not uncomfortable, not heavy, just present, like the space itself was waiting to see what I would do with the control I had just claimed. So I stay, I said finally, not as a question, not even as a declaration, just a quiet acknowledgement of the path I had already stepped onto. Dominic did not react immediately, did not nod or confirm or turn it into something larger than it was. He simply accepted it the way someone accepts something they expected all along. Then you stay, he replied, and there was something in the simplicity of it that made it feel more real than anything dramatic ever could. I glanced around the space again, slower this time, letting my eyes settle on details I had missed before, the way everything was placed with intention, nothing excessive, nothing careless. Like even the air here had been curated. Do I get a tour? I asked, because standing still felt like the only thing that did not belong in this moment anymore. A faint shift touched his expression again, something that almost resembled amusement. If you need one, he said. I do. I replied, meeting his gaze, because I was not going to pretend I understood any of this yet. He gestured lightly, not leading, not directing, just indicating the space around us. Then start walking, he said. I moved first this time. The shift was small, but I felt it, the difference between following and choosing to step forward on my own. The floor beneath my heels was smooth, the sound soft, controlled, like everything else in this place. And as I walked, I began to notice the details that made this feel less like a showpiece and more like a life. A glass of water placed exactly where someone would reach for it. A jacket draped over the back of a chair with deliberate carelessness. A book left open on a table like it had been set down mid-thought. "You live here alone," I said, glancing back at him. "Yes," he answered. I nodded once, processing that, because a place like this could easily feel empty. But it did not. It felt occupied, even in the quiet. I stepped closer to the window, looking out at the city again. But this time it felt different, less like something distant and more like something within reach. "This is a lot to step into in one night," I said, more to myself than to him. "It is," he agreed. I turned slightly, studying him again, trying to understand how someone could stand so firmly in a world that felt so new to me. "And you are not worried," I said, "that I will wake up tomorrow and decide this was a mistake?" He did not hesitate. "No," he said. The certainty in that single word should have annoyed me, should have made me question him more. But instead it made me curious. "Why?" I asked. He took a step closer, not closing the distance completely, just enough to make his presence feel more defined. "Because you did not choose this out of impulse," he said. "You chose it because you recognized something you refused to accept anymore." I held his gaze, feeling the truth in that settle somewhere deeper than I expected. He was right. This was not about him. Not really. It was about me deciding I was done being the version of myself that stayed where I was not valued. "And what happens tomorrow?" I asked quietly. His expression softened just slightly, not in weakness, but in something more measured. "Tomorrow," he said, "you wake up in a life where no one decides your place for you." I let that sit, the weight of it both comforting and unfamiliar, like trying on something that fit perfectly but still felt new. I looked back out at the city one more time, then back at him, and for the first time since I walked into that wedding, I felt something steady settle in my chest. Not certainty, not complete understanding, but something close enough to trust. Because whatever this was, whatever I had just stepped into, it was not built on what I had lost. It was built on what I had finally decided I deserved. The idea of waking up in a life where no one decided my place should have felt overwhelming. But instead it settled into me quietly, like something I had been missing for longer than I realized. I turned away from the window, letting the city lights blur behind me, and for the first time that night, I became aware of something simple and human. I was tired, not just physically, but emotionally. Like every version of me from the last few hours had finally caught up at once. I let out a small breath, brushing my fingers lightly along the edge of the table as if grounding myself in something real. I did not think about where I would sleep, I admitted, the words slipping out more honestly than I intended. Dominic did not react with surprise or amusement, just that same calm attention that made everything feel intentional. "You will not have to think about that," he said. I glanced at him, one eyebrow lifting slightly, because that answer felt like it carried more than just a simple solution. "That sounds like a decision you already made," I replied. "It is," he said. I crossed my arms lightly, not defensive, just aware, because I was starting to understand the rhythm of how he operated, the way he anticipated before I even asked. "And what if I want to make that decision myself?" I said. He held my gaze for a moment, and there it was again, that subtle shift, like he adjusted without resistance. "Then you will," he answered. The simplicity of it caught me off guard, because I had expected negotiation, expectation, something that would remind me I had stepped into his world, but instead he kept placing the control back in my hands in a way that felt deliberate. I looked around the space again, slower this time, noticing a hallway leading further in, doors closed, spaces I had not seen yet. "Then show me," I said, nodding slightly toward it. He gestured again, not leading, just allowing, and I walked ahead, my steps quieter now, more measured, like I was becoming aware of how I moved in this new environment. The hallway opened into a bedroom that felt consistent with everything else, clean, intentional, nothing unnecessary, but still undeniably lived in. I paused just inside, taking in the details, the bed perfectly made, the the soft lighting, the absence of anything chaotic or out of place. "This is yours," I said, glancing back at him. "This is one of them," he corrected. I blinked, caught off guard again, because of course it was not just one. I stepped further inside, running my fingers lightly over the edge of the dresser, grounding myself again in something tangible. "And where do I sleep?" I asked, turning back to face him fully now. There was no hesitation in his answer. "Wherever you choose," he said. The words hung in the air between us, simple but layered, because they carried more than just the question of a room. They carried space, boundaries, respect. I studied him for a second, trying to understand if there was anything hidden beneath that answer, anything unspoken, but there was nothing, just a clear line that he was not going to cross unless I did first. I let out a quiet breath. The tension I did not realize I was holding easing slightly. "You are very careful," I said. "I am very precise," he corrected. I nodded once, accepting that, because it fit everything else I had seen so far. I glanced at the bed, then back at him, making a decision that felt small compared to everything else, but still mine. "I will take this room," I said. He inclined his head slightly, like that was exactly what he expected. "Then it is yours," he replied. I moved further into the space, setting down the weight of the day piece by piece, the dress, the expectations, the version of myself that had walked into that wedding thinking she knew how her life would unfold. And as I stood there, in a room that was now mine by choice, not by circumstance, I realized something that shifted everything again. He had not asked anything from me. Not yet. Not a promise, not a role, not even a reason. And somehow, that made this feel more binding than anything else ever could. Standing in a room that was now mine should have felt like the end of something. But instead it felt like the beginning of something I could not fully define yet. I moved slowly, almost carefully, like if I rushed, I might miss the meaning behind how I got here, my fingers brushing against the edge of the dresser before I reached for the zipper of my dress. The fabric loosened with a soft sound, the weight of it sliding from my shoulders. And for a moment I just stood there, no longer the woman in white, no longer the version of myself that had walked into that ceremony expecting a future that never came. I folded the dress neatly, placing it on the chair instead of letting it fall, because even though that chapter had ended, it did not deserve to be discarded carelessly. When I stepped into the adjoining bathroom, the light came on automatically, soft and warm, reflecting back a version of me I barely recognized. Not because I had changed physically, but because something in my eyes had shifted, steadier, more aware. I washed my hands slowly, watching the water run over my skin like I was trying to reset something deeper than just the surface, then reached for a towel that had already been placed exactly where I needed it. Everything here anticipated me, and I was still learning how to exist in that kind of space. When I stepped back into the room, Dominic was no longer standing in the doorway, but I could feel his presence somewhere beyond it, not intrusive, not watching, just there. I changed into one of the soft robes folded at the foot of the bed, the fabric light against my skin, unfamiliar but comfortable. And when I finally sat down on the edge of the mattress, I let the silence settle around me again. It was different now, not empty, not uncertain, but full of something I had not felt in a long time. Possibility. A soft knock broke the stillness, not loud, not demanding, just enough to let me know I was not alone. "Come in," I said, my voice calm in a way that surprised me. The door opened just slightly, and Dominic stepped in, stopping just inside like he was giving the space time to adjust to his presence. His gaze moved briefly across the room, then settled on me, not assessing, not questioning, just acknowledging. "Everything you need is already here," he said. I tilted my head slightly, studying him, because I was starting to recognize the pattern in how he spoke, direct, intentional, never more than necessary. "You planned for that too," I said. "I plan for what matters," he replied. I let out a small breath, something close to a quiet laugh, because that answer felt both simple and impossibly layered at the same time. "And what matters right now?" I asked, leaning back slightly, not guarded, just curious. His expression did not change, but his voice softened just enough to make the words feel more personal. "That you rest," he said. I blinked, caught off guard by that, because it was not what I expected, not a condition, not a request, just a statement that felt almost protective. "You are not going to tell me what tomorrow looks like," I said. He shook his head once. "Tomorrow will come on its own," he replied. I studied him for a second longer, then nodded, because for once, I did not need to know everything ahead of time to feel steady. He turned slightly, already moving toward the door, then paused just long enough to add, "If you need anything, you ask." I watched him leave, the door closing softly behind him, and for a moment I just sat there, letting everything settle into place. The city lights still stretched endlessly beyond the window, but they no longer felt distant. They felt like something I could step into when I was ready. I lay back against the bed, the softness of it grounding me in a way I did not expect, and as I stared at the ceiling, one thought settled into my mind with quiet certainty. For the first time, I was not waiting for someone else to decide what happened next. I was already living it. I did not remember falling asleep, only the feeling of finally letting go, like my mind had reached a point where it could not hold any more of the day without breaking. When I opened my eyes, the light in the room had changed, softer, quieter, the kind that comes early in the morning before the city fully wakes up. For a moment, I did not move, just lay there, letting the stillness settle around me. Because for the first time in a long time, I was not waking up with anxiety already waiting for me. I turned my head slightly, taking in the unfamiliar ceiling, the clean lines of the room, and then it all came back, not in a rush, not overwhelming, just a clear, steady awareness. I sat up slowly, the robe still wrapped loosely around me, and glanced toward the window where the skyline stretched out under a pale morning sky. Everything looked the same out there, but I knew it was not. I stood, crossing the room at an unhurried pace, my reflection catching briefly in the glass, and I paused, studying it. There was no dramatic difference, no visible transformation, but there was something in the way I held myself, less tension in my shoulders, less hesitation in the way I stood. I looked like someone who had made a decision and was not questioning it anymore. A soft sound from beyond the door pulled my attention back, not loud, just movement, quiet and controlled. And for a second I wondered if I should stay where I was, if I should take more time to adjust before stepping out into whatever came next. But that thought passed quickly. I was not here to hesitate. I opened the door. The space outside felt different in the morning, brighter but still composed, like nothing here ever lost its sense of control. I followed the subtle sound toward the kitchen area, and that was where I saw him. Dominic stood near the counter, sleeves slightly rolled, his attention focused on something simple, a cup in his hand, movements precise but unhurried. He looked up the moment I stepped into the space, not startled, not surprised, just aware. "You are awake," he said. I nodded once, stepping closer, not stopping at the edge of the room this time, but moving into it like I belonged there. "I am," I replied. There was a brief silence, not awkward, just present, like both of us were adjusting to this new version of reality. "Did you sleep?" he asked. The question was simple, but there was something in the way he asked it that made it feel intentional. "Yes," I said, and then after a second, more honestly, "Better than I expected." He nodded slightly, as if that confirmed something for him. "Good," he said. I leaned lightly against the counter, watching him for a moment, noticing the difference in him now, not less controlled, but more grounded, like this was his normal, not the version of him I had seen in a moment of disruption. "So this is what your world looks like in the morning," I said. He set the cup down, turning slightly toward me. "This is what it looks like when it is quiet," he replied. I let that settle, because it matched everything else I had seen so far. Nothing here was accidental. Everything had a purpose, even the calm. "And when it is not quiet?" I asked. His gaze held mine for a second longer, and there was something in it that suggested layers I had not yet seen. "You will see," he said. I nodded once, accepting that answer for now, because I understood that some things were not explained, they were experienced. I glanced around the space again, then back at him, a thought forming clearly in my mind. "I am not going back," I said, not as a question, not as something I needed him to confirm, just a statement of fact. He did not react with surprise, did not question it, just accepted it the same way he had accepted everything else I had chosen. "No," he said quietly, "you are not." I held his gaze for a moment longer, feeling the weight of that settle into something solid. Yesterday, I had been left behind. Today, I had walked away, and as I stood there, in a place that no longer felt unfamiliar, I realized something that made everything else fall into place. I had not been replaced. I had replaced the life that could not hold me. Replacing a life that could not hold me sounded powerful when I said it out loud. But as the morning settled in around me, I began to understand that power was not always loud. Sometimes it was quiet, steady, and almost invisible. I watched Dominic for a moment longer. The way he moved through his own space without hesitation, without second-guessing, like everything around him responded to his presence rather than the other way around. What happens today? I asked, because even though I had accepted that I was not going back, I still needed to understand what stepping forward actually meant. He reached for another cup, setting it beside the one already on the counter, then looked at me, not rushed, not distracted, just focused. Today, he said, you start living like you made a decision, not like something happened to you. I let that sit. The words simple, but layered in a way that made them harder to ignore than anything dramatic ever could have been. And how exactly do I do that? I asked, folding my arms lightly, not defensive, just thinking. He slid the cup toward me, a small, quiet gesture that somehow carried more weight than it should have. You stop explaining yourself, he said. I blinked, caught off guard, because that was not the answer I expected. To who? I asked. His expression did not change. To anyone, he replied. I looked down at the cup for a second, the warmth rising from it grounding me in the moment, and I realized how automatic that instinct had been, to justify, to explain, to make things make sense to people who were never going to understand anyway. That is easier said than done, I said quietly. It is easier than staying where you were not respected. He replied. I nodded once, because that part one understood now in a way I had not before. There was a brief silence, not empty, just thoughtful, like both of us were letting the conversation settle into something more than just words. People are going to ask questions, I said after a moment, because that was inevitable. The calls, the messages, the curiosity disguised as concern. They will, he agreed. And you are not going to answer them. I continued, more statement than question. You can answer whatever you choose, he said, but you do not owe anyone access to your life anymore. I exhaled slowly, the weight of that realization settling deeper than I expected, because it was not just about this situation, it was about everything that had come before it. Every time I had explained, justified, minimized myself to make other people comfortable. And what about him? I asked, the words slipping out before I could stop it. Not his name. Just the presence of someone who had been part of my life until he chose not to be. Dominic did not react, did not question, just acknowledged the direction of my thoughts. He made his decision, he said. And you made yours. Simple, clean, no space for anything else to complicate it. I nodded slowly, because that was the truth I needed, not closure, not confrontation, just clarity. I lifted the cup, taking a small sip, the warmth steady, real, grounding me further into this new reality. And what about us? I asked, setting it back down, because that was the part that still felt undefined. His gaze held mine, steady, unwavering, like he had already considered every version of that question. We do not rush something that was built on a decision this deliberate, he said. I studied him for a second, letting that settle, because it was not what I expected, not pressure, not expectation, just space. So we just exist, I said. For now, he replied. I nodded once, because for the first time, that did not feel uncertain. It felt right. Not knowing everything, not having every step mapped out, but still feeling steady in the direction I had chosen. I glanced out the window again, the city now fully awake, moving, shifting, continuing like it always did, but I no longer felt like I was trying to keep up with it. I felt like I had finally stepped into a place where I could move at my own pace. And as I stood there, no longer someone reacting to what had been taken from me, but someone deciding what came next, I realized something that made everything else fall into place. I was not starting over. I was starting differently. Starting differently sounded simple when I said it in my head, but as I stood there with the morning light stretching across the floor and the quiet rhythm of the city moving beyond the glass, I realized it was not simple at all. It was intentional, and that made all the difference. I turned back from the window, my gaze finding Dominic again, not because I needed direction, but because I was beginning to understand the role he played in this moment, not as someone who led me, but as someone who stood beside a decision I had already made. There is something I need to be clear about, I said, my voice calm but firm, because this was the part that mattered most. He did not interrupt, did not shift, just gave me his full attention in a way that made the space between us feel steady. I did not walk into this to be saved. I continued, holding his gaze. And I am not here to become something that only exists because of you. There was no tension in his expression, no resistance, just that same quiet understanding that had been there from the beginning. Good, he said, and there was something in that single word that felt like confirmation rather than challenge. I took a small breath, the kind that settles something internal into place, because this was not about drawing lines against him. It was about defining them for myself. I am here because I chose to be, I added, softer now, but no less certain. He nodded once, a small movement, but deliberate. Then do not forget. That, he replied. I studied him for a moment longer, the simplicity of his response grounding in a way I had not expected, because there was no attempt to reshape my words, no attempt to claim them, just acceptance. I stepped closer, not hesitating this time, not measuring the distance, just closing it because it felt natural. And you, I said, tilting my head slightly. You do not seem like someone who shares space easily. A faint shift crossed his expression, something that almost resembled honesty without defense. I do not, he said. I nodded, because that fit everything I had seen so far. Then why me? I asked, not because I needed validation, but because I wanted truth. He did not answer immediately, and for the first time, the pause felt different, not calculated, not controlled, just real. Because you walked away when most people would have stayed, he said finally, his voice lower now, more personal. And because you did it without asking anyone for permission. The words settled into me in a way that felt unexpected, not like praise, not like admiration, but like recognition, like he had seen something in me before I fully understood it myself. I let out a quiet breath, the tension I had not realized I was holding easing completely this time. So what happens now? I asked, not because I was uncertain, but because I wanted to hear how he defined something that I had already begun to understand. His gaze held mine, steady as always. But there was something different beneath it now, something less distant. Now, he said, we do not pretend this is something it is not. I frowned slightly, curious. And what is it? I asked. He took a small step closer, just enough to make the space between us intentional again. It is two people who made a decision, he said. And now we see what that decision becomes. I let that settle, the simplicity of it cutting through everything else that could have complicated it. No expectations, no forced meaning, just space for something real to take shape. I nodded once, because for the first time, that felt like enough. Not knowing everything, not defining everything, just allowing something to exist without pressure. I glanced around the space one more time, then back at him. And something in me felt steady in a way I had never experienced before, not because everything was certain, but because I was. And as the city continued to move beyond the glass, unchanged and unaware, I realized something that made everything else fall into place. He did not take my broken moment and fix it. He stepped into it, stood beside me, and let me rebuild it into something stronger. And somehow, that mattered more than anything else ever could.